the Marine who held a ridge alone for 48 hours. The rain came down in sheets that November morning, turning the ridge into a river of mud and broken stone. Private First Class Daniel Crow pressed himself against the coral outcropping, his Springfield rifle clutched tight against his chest, and tried to remember what warmth felt like. 48 hours earlier, there had been 16 men on this ridge. Now, there was only him and the dead, and the certainty that the Japanese would come again before dawn. The island had no name that mattered. On the maps back at Division Headquarters, it was marked as Objective 73 Baker, a volcanic knuckle of rock and jungle rising 200 feet above the contested beachhead. To the men who fought for it, it was simply the ridge, and it commanded the only approach to the airfield 3 miles inland. Whoever held the ridge controlled the valley. Whoever controlled the valley decided the fate of 10,000 Marines dug in along the black sand beaches below. Crow was 22 years old. He had worked in his father's lumber mill in Oregon before the war, a quiet boy who kept to himself and read books about places he would never see. The Marine Corps had taken that quiet boy and taught him how to kill, how to dig a fighting hole in coral that could break an entrenching tool, how to sleep standing up with his eyes open. They had not taught him how to be alone. The first attack had come at dusk on the first day, when the platoon was still at full strength. Lieutenant Morrison had placed the men in a defensive perimeter along the ridge's southern face, where the slope was gentlest and the jungle grew thick enough to provide concealment for an advancing enemy. Crow had been assigned to the westernmost position, a shallow depression between two coral formations that gave him a clear field of fire down the slope. He had filled sandbags with volcanic soil, stacked them in a low wall, and waited with the others for what they all knew was coming. They came screaming. That was what Crow remembered most clearly afterward, in the long hours when memory was all he had. The Japanese soldiers came up the slope in a wave of khaki and steel, their voices raised in a cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the ridge erupted in fire. Crow worked the bolt of his Springfield with hands that did not shake, selecting targets, breathing, squeezing, watching men fall and be replaced by others who kept coming through the smoke and the rain. The bar gunner to his right, a corporal from Kansas City whose name was Tucker, fired in controlled bursts that cut through the jungle like a scythe through wheat. The ridge held. They came again at midnight, and again just before dawn, and each time the perimeter held but grew smaller. Tucker took a bullet through the throat during the second attack and died, making sounds that Crow could still hear when he closed his eyes. Morrison was hit in the chest during the third attack and lived long enough to tell Sergeant Hayes to hold the ridge at all costs. By noon of the second day, there were 7 men left, and the Japanese were massing in the valley below for another push. Hayes had been a Marine for 12 years. He had fought in Nicaragua and China, and he moved through combat with the calm certainty of a man who had long since made peace with his own death. He gathered the remaining men in the center of the perimeter and spoke in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. The ridge was down to 7 rifles and less than 300 rounds of ammunition. There were no reinforcements available. The company was pinned down on the beach, and battalion had its hands full holding the flanks. The ridge was on its own. Hayes assigned sectors of fire and told each man to make every round count. He told them that relief would come, that they just had to hold until the situation on the beach stabilized. He told them this because it was what they needed to hear, and because lies became truth when spoken by men who believed them. Then he took his position on the northern slope and waited for the Japanese to come again. They came at dusk, as the rain turned torrential and visibility dropped to 50 yards. They came in a coordinated assault from 3 directions at once, probing for weakness, and they found it on the eastern slope where 2 riflemen from Tennessee had been killed by mortar fire an hour before. The Japanese poured through the gap, and the perimeter collapsed inward like a fist closing. Crow saw Hayes go down swinging his trench knife at shapes in the rain. He saw the last of the bar ammunition spent in a long, defiant burst that bought seconds, nothing more. He saw Private Wilson, who was 19 and engaged to a girl in Pennsylvania, take a bayonet to the stomach and fall without a sound. And then Crow was running, his rifle empty, his hands grabbing grenades from the bodies of the dead, pulling pins, counting seconds, throwing them into the mass of enemy soldiers swarming over the ridge. The explosions were thunder and light in the rain, and men screamed in Japanese and English and the universal language of pain. Crow threw 4 grenades, then 5, then 6, until there were no more grenades left, and the Japanese fell back to regroup in the darkness below. The ridge was silent except for the rain. Crow stood in the center of the perimeter, breathing hard, and realized he was alone. Alone with the dead who had been his brothers. Alone with 2 clips of ammunition and a rifle that was still slick with mud. Alone on a ridge that no longer had any defensive line, any fields of fire, any plan beyond the simple imperative to survive until dawn. He moved through the position, gathering what he could. Ammunition from the dead, their clips and bandoliers slippery with rain and blood. A canteen still half, full of warm water. Hayes's binoculars, cracked but functional. A K-bar knife from Tucker's belt. The Japanese would come again, probably before first light, and when they came they would find only one Marine between them and the valley, but that one Marine would make them pay for every foot of muddy ground. Crow chose his position carefully. The western edge of the ridge offered the best defensive ground, a narrow approach flanked by steep drops on both sides. A single man could hold it if he was willing to die doing it. He dragged bodies to create a low barricade, not because he wanted to hide behind the men he had known, but because the dead no longer cared and the living needed every advantage. He stacked ammunition within easy reach. He field-stripped his rifle, cleaned it as best he could in the rain, and reloaded with hands that had finally started to shake. Then he waited. The rain continued. The jungle below rustled with movement that could have been wind or men or the ghosts of every soldier who had ever died on ground that would forget them by morning. Crow's legs trembled from exhaustion. His stomach was empty, his canteen was running low, and the cold had worked its way deep into his bones where no amount of movement could warm him. He thought about Oregon, about the smell of sawdust and pine, about the way morning fog rolled through the valleys west of the Cascades. He thought about the last letter he had received from his mother, still folded in his pocket, though the ink had run in the rain and the words were illegible now. The attack came 2 hours before dawn. They came quietly this time, no screaming, just shadows moving up the slope with the patience of men who knew the ridge was theirs for the taking. Crow spotted them through Hayes's binoculars, counted at least 20, and felt something cold and certain settle in his chest. He let them come close, 50 yards, 40, 30, waiting until he could see individual faces in the darkness. Then he opened fire. The Springfield barked once, twice, 3 times, the bolt working smoothly under his hands, the recoil familiar as breathing. Men fell. The shadows scattered, seeking cover, returning fire that cracked past Crow's head and sparked off the coral. He kept firing, methodically, selecting targets, breathing between shots, moving after every third round to avoid giving away his position. The Japanese tried to flank him on both sides and found only steep slopes and darkness. They tried to rush his position and met rifle fire that dropped the first 2 men and sent the others diving for cover. The firefight lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, the Japanese pulled back again, leaving their dead on the slope, and Crow was down to his last clip of ammunition. He sat with his back against the coral and listened to his own heart hammering in his ears. His hands were bleeding from working the rifle's bolt. His shoulder ached from the recoil. The rain had soaked through every layer of clothing, and his teeth chattered uncontrollably. He was so tired that closing his eyes felt like falling into a well with no bottom. But he could not sleep. Sleep was death, and death was not yet something he was willing to accept. He stood, forced his legs to move, and began the slow walk around his position, checking sight lines, counting rounds, preparing for the next attack that would surely come. The ridge was his now, his alone, and he would hold it because there was nothing else left to do. Dawn came slowly, bleeding gray light through clouds that seemed to press down on the ridge like a coffin lid. Crow stood at his post and watched the valley below take shape in the growing light. He could see the Japanese forming up again, more of them this time, preparing for an assault that would finally sweep the ridge clean. He had 8 rounds left. 8 rounds against an enemy that numbered in the dozens, perhaps hundreds. The mathematics were simple and absolute. He thought about running. The northern slope was steep but climbable, and there was jungle beyond that could hide a man if he was careful. He could slip away, work his way back to American lines, live to fight another day. No one would blame him. No one would even know. The dead could not tell tales, and the Japanese would take the ridge regardless of whether one Marine died, defending it, or slipped away in the dawn. But he did not run. Something in him, something forged in the Oregon woods and tempered in the fires of Paris Island and hardened in the blood and coral of the Pacific, would not allow it. He had been given a job. Hold the ridge. Those had been Morrison's last words, Hayes's final order, and orders were simple things that did not care about odds or survival or the small, terrified voice in the back of Crow's mind that wanted nothing more than to go home. The Japanese attacked at full dawn. They came in force, a coordinated assault that swept up the slope from 3 directions, and Crow met them with rifle fire that was precise and unhurried despite the fear that threatened to choke him. He dropped the first man at 60 yards, the second at 50, worked the bolt, fired again, and watched a squad leader fall, clutching his chest. The rifle cracked and sang and spoke with a voice that said, "This ground is held. This ground is bought and paid for in blood. This ground is not yours to take." He killed 4 men with 4 shots. The 5th shot went wide as a mortar round exploded 20 yards to his left, showering him with dirt and coral fragments that stung his face like hornets. He worked the bolt, fired his 6th round into a soldier who was climbing over the barricade of bodies, watched him fall backward and disappear. 2 rounds left. The Japanese were on the ridge now, bayonets fixed, moving through the smoke and rain with the determination of men who could taste victory. Crow fired his 7th round point blank into the chest of a soldier who lunged at him with a rifle, then swung his Springfield like a club and felt the stock connect with bone. His last round went into the stomach of another soldier, and then the rifle was empty and there was only the K-bar in his hand and the certainty that this was how it ended. He fought with the knife. He fought with his fists and his boots and his teeth when the knife was knocked from his grasp. He fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove to the ghosts watching from their coral graves. Blood ran down his face from a gash above his eye. His ribs screamed with pain from a kick that might have cracked bone. His vision narrowed to a tunnel that showed him only the enemy in front of him, the hands reaching for his throat, the bayonet seeking his heart. And then there was thunder that was not thunder, and the air above the ridge screamed with incoming artillery. The Japanese soldiers scattered, diving for cover, and Crow collapsed against the coral and watched shells tear apart the slope where the enemy had been massing for their final push. The bombardment lasted 5 minutes, a carefully orchestrated symphony of high explosives that turned the jungle into matchsticks and scattered the Japanese assault like leaves in a storm. When it ended, there was silence. Crow lay on his back and stared at the gray sky and tried to understand that he was still alive. His body was a map of pain, each breath a reminder of broken things that would need time to heal. But he was breathing. The ridge was still his. The relief force found him an hour later. They came up the slope cautiously, weapons ready, expecting to find nothing but corpses. Instead, they found a young Marine sitting among the dead, a knife in his lap, his eyes focused on something 1,000 yards distant. The lieutenant in charge of the relief force stopped when he saw the scene, saw the bodies stacked in makeshift barricades, saw the spent brass scattered like seeds, saw the blood painting the coral in shades of rust and crimson. They pulled Crow to his feet and tried to get him to talk, to tell them what had happened, but words seemed inadequate to the task. How do you explain 48 hours condensed into heartbeats and rifle shots? How do you describe the weight of being the last man, standing when better men have fallen? The lieutenant stopped asking questions and simply helped Crow down the slope, one arm around his shoulders, supporting him when his legs refused to work. At the aid station, they cleaned his wounds and gave him water and hot coffee that tasted like the finest thing he had ever consumed. The battalion commander came by to shake his hand and talk about medals and commendations, words that meant nothing to a man who was still trying to understand why he was alive when 16 others were not. Crow nodded when expected to nod, saluted when expected to salute, and said nothing at all. They sent him to the rear for rest. 3 days in a tent with a cot and hot meals and no sound of gunfire. 3 days to remember how to be something other than a Marine holding a ridge against the world. But rest did not come easily. He lay on the cot and stared at the canvas above him and heard Tucker choking on his own blood. He closed his eyes and saw Hayes going down with his knife raised in defiance. He slept and dreamed of rain and rifle fire and shadows climbing toward him through the darkness. On the 4th day, he asked to be sent back to his unit. The doctor protested, said he needed more time, but Crow knew that time would not heal what the ridge had broken inside him. The only way forward was through, back to the men who understood without words what it meant to stand on ground that would not yield. They gave him a new rifle and new gear and sent him back to the line. The ridge had been secured, reinforced, turned into a strong point that anchored the division's advance inland. Crow walked past his old position and saw fresh-faced replacements digging fighting holes in the coral, joking with each other the way men do when they have not yet learned what were truly costs. He said nothing to them. There was nothing to say that they would understand until they had paid the same price. In the years that followed, after the war had ended and the victory parades had faded and the world moved on to new conflicts and new concerns, Daniel Crow returned to Oregon. He worked in his father's lumber mill, married a schoolteacher from Portland, raised 2 children who never knew hunger or fear or the sound of mortars falling in the rain. He did not speak about the ridge. When people asked about his service, he said simply that he had been a Marine and left it at that. But sometimes, on November mornings when the rain came down in sheets and turned the ground to mud, he would stand at his window and remember. He would remember the weight of a rifle in his hands, the sound of men dying in the darkness, the cold certainty that comes when there is no choice but to stand and fight and hope that it matters. He would remember Tucker and Hayes and Morrison and all the others who never came home, who gave everything they had on a ridge that most people would never hear about, for a victory that was measured in yards gained and days survived. He never considered himself a hero. Heroes were for stories and statues, for ceremonies and speeches that reduced complex truths to simple narratives. He had done what was asked of him, nothing more, nothing less. He had held the ridge because it needed holding, because men he respected had told him it mattered, because walking away would have meant betraying something fundamental about who he was and who he wanted to be. In his 80s, when his hands shook and his legs no longer carried him far, he agreed to speak to a historian documenting the Pacific Campaign. They sat in his living room, the recorder running, and the historian asked him what it felt like to be alone on that ridge for 48 hours. Crow was quiet for a long time, watching rain streak down the window, choosing his words with the same care he had once used choosing targets in the darkness. "I was never alone," he said finally. "The dead were with me. My brothers were with me. Every Marine who ever stood his ground when running made more sense, they were all there on that ridge. I was just the one who happened to survive to tell about it." The historian pressed for more details, for dramatic moments and turning points, for the kind of concrete specifics that make history come alive. But Crow shook his head. Some things could not be reduced to anecdotes and timelines. Some experiences existed in a place beyond words, where memory and meaning merged into something that could only be understood by those who had been there, who had stood in the rain with empty rifles and full hearts and refused to yield. He died on a November morning, quietly, in his sleep. His children found the medals in a box in the basement, dusty and forgotten, ribbons faded from years of neglect. Among them was the Navy Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat, for actions on a ridge that had held when all logic said it should fall. The citation spoke of valor and determination and devotion to duty, words chosen by men who had not been there, who could only guess at what those 48 hours had contained. But the medal was not what mattered. What mattered was the ridge and the men who died there, and the single Marine who held it alone because there was no other choice and no better reason. What mattered was the understanding that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That heroism is not about glory, but about doing what must be done when everything else has fallen away. The ridge still stands, reclaimed now by jungle, marked by no monument or plaque. The coral has weathered smooth under decades of tropical rain. The fighting holes have filled with soil and sprouted vegetation. There is no sign that men once fought and died there, no indication that this ground was once the fulcrum on which a battle turned. But the ridge remembers in a way that earth remembers all the blood it has swallowed, all the courage it has witnessed, all the small, desperate stands that make up the larger story of what we are capable of when we are tested beyond measure. And somewhere in the fabric of what we call history, in the space between documented facts and forgotten truths, the story persists. A young Marine, alone on a ridge in the rain, holding ground that would not yield, firing his rifle into the darkness, standing when standing seemed impossible, surviving when survival seemed absurd. Not because he was special or chosen or blessed with some extraordinary gift, but because he was ordinary, and ordinary men are capable of extraordinary things when circumstance and duty and brotherhood demand it. That is the story. That is what the ridge holds, what the rain cannot wash away, what time cannot diminish. One Marine, alone for 48 hours, holding the line because the line needed holding, carrying the weight of those who fell before him, standing in their place, speaking with their voices, refusing to let their sacrifice be rendered meaningless by his own failure. The war moved on. The ridge was forgotten. The names of the dead faded from memory like morning mist. But somewhere in the darkness, in the space between thunder and silence, the echo remains. One man, one rifle, one choice made in rain and blood and fear. To stand, to hold, to endure. That is what we remember when we remember the Marine who held the ridge alone. Not the heroism of monuments and history books, but the quiet, terrible courage of simply refusing to break when breaking would have been so much easier. That is the story. That is what remains.